This is an overview of the vendor risk managed services provided by the SCE Group. My name is Charlie McCoy. I'm a senior professional services engineer who is intimately involved in the vendor risk managed services offering. The managed service offering allows you to offload a lot of the day-to-day interaction between your vendors during an assessment period. One of the things that we would do is provide consultation at the beginning to determine what level of criticality the vendor is that you need to assess. This will be determined by discussions and or preliminary setups of different types of tiers or requirements that would be necessary for the particular vendor in question. This will be determined based on the type of data that the vendor has access to or the type of services that are provided. Obviously, you would not want to do a full assessment on a vendor that doesn't have access to confidential information. But for the ones that do, then you would want to be a lot more thorough with the assessment that goes on. Once the vendor has been determined that needs to be assessed, we would gather the information appropriate to that vendor. We would need to know the type of data they have access to. We would need to know the vendor contact and the email address. Once we determine what requirements that particular vendor assessment are, then we would make an initial contact with the vendor. We have a template invitation email that you can see here. This is an invitation that we would send out to the vendor contact. That this would notify them that an assessment is about to begin. At that point, then we would go into our console and set up a relationship. Here's the vendor risk manager, and I've already set up a relationship for this particular setup. We would go determine we would put in the different types of things. We put in the email address to identify that particular vendor or the asset, and then we would build a relationship based on the asset and then based on the requirements that are there. So in this console, we can see that we have a lot of different requirements that could be there. We could use a full SIG, or in this one, we were just using the SIG-Lite. So as you can see, this assessment is already in progress. And so after the assessment has been sent out, one thing that'll happen is the contact will receive a registration email. And I'll pull this up to see this is what the email looks like. It comes from this risk manager at complianceasaservice.net, and it will give you a secure link to register your account with the vendor gateway system. And if you log into the vendor gateway system, the vendor will get a view that looks like this. And then they can take their survey and go through and answer questions, however that works. And then they can save it and go back to it later, pick up where they left off. Another option as well, you can also import and export. They could actually take this, export it to an XLS file or an Excel file, and answer the questions offline, and then come back to this vendor gateway and then import all the questions at one time if that makes more sense to them. So as the vendor happens, then it will allow them to go and make that, answer the questions and then submit. Typically, we usually have an understanding that the vendor would respond within 2 weeks. We can adjust that timetable based on lots of different things, but usually we go with 2 weeks. In some cases, we've gone with 3 weeks. It all depends. But getting the vendor to respond is something that we would do ongoing. And as you see that this is in progress, I can select this and go to the history and see kind of when the vendor has actually logged in and done some type of activity. So I can check the activity of the vendor before they submit to make sure that they're continuing to update. Normally in the situation with that, I would go to the during the response time, I would monitor that. And after a few days, if I see that they haven't responded, send a reminder email to see that happens and to make that happen. Another thing that we can provide also is we can also provide um, requests based on documentation, and we can provide a form that would allow documentation to be uploaded. And here's a current client that I have that we can show what we've done with them. So in this case, we see we've got a survey and we got a flex form. So I can take that, look at the evidence, and see that they have actually uploaded a lot of documentation here. And so we can go back here to this, and this is the console that will go in. Once all the documentation has been submitted, then we can go in and actually analyze the particular information that's there. Go back to this, pull the information up. And as we can see the different items that passed and failed. And this particular, as we can see, each one of the failed items, me as a reviewer has gone in and added a particular comment based on lots of different things. And so this will allow us to identify within the report that's generated from this console which ones have failed and which ones need to have particular work done to them. After all the documentation and the survey has been submitted, then we would take and actually build a summary report. And here's an example of what the summary report looks like. What we do with the summary report, we take all of the things that failed or didn't meet the standard in the survey, and we'll document each one of those. And I break those down into different sections, break them down into findings, and these are anything that's considered medium or high risk. And then I have a section called findings with compensating controls or other supporting evidence. And a lot of times the questions that are answered have comments that give supporting evidence behind controls that are in place for that particular item, for that particular issue, or they have submitted other documentation that validates that information is there. And so I pull this out to say findings with compensating controls. It still allows you as a client to be able to take that information and analyze that information and quickly look at the things that were considered issues, but then have some level of justification or compensating controls that happen. Next, we'll go over to the certain type of documents that here. This is an analysis of the information security policy that was uploaded by this particular vendor. They've also provided a SOC 1, and so I've taken out the pertinent information from the SOC 1, or actually this is a SOC 2, and I've given the auditor's opinion, and then any of these common criteria tests that were set to be exceptions to the rules. I pulled up the information that was provided and basically given that to you in this summary report, so you don't have to go and look through the entire document. And then in addition, we also take a look at this one. We took a look at penetration test, and we pulled the information out from there. So the summary report gives that type of information, and then we give you an assessment rating at the top of that. In addition to that, we also provide remediation recommendations and a spreadsheet that will allow you to take each one of the items that were considered findings and pull them into some recommendations that we provide, and then you can use this spreadsheet to contact your vendors if you'd like with a management response to that particular finding or item, and you can track that. So what this does for you, once the documentation has been submitted, we have current SLAs in place to have those assessment reports back to you within a reasonable amount of time. Normally for SIG lights, we do a 5 business day SLA agreement, and for full SIGs, we do a 7-day. And so what this means is that from start to finish, if the vendors are responsive and they submit everything within a 2-week period, then ideally, from the start to finish, your vendor assessment will be done within about 3 weeks. In best case scenarios, that happens a lot quicker than that. It all depends on the level of response that the vendors have. Another piece of the vendor risk management services is something called the vendor threat monitor. And this is an example of what that would look like. The vendor threat monitor gives the client the ability to go look at things that happen actively within the internet, and with things that it goes out and crawls the web to try to figure out certain things. So we'll take a look at this particular vendor, and as it pulls up the information, we can see that there's certain things that are there. It shows data risks that are available, things that are business risk, whether they're medium, critical, or low risk types of information. And we can see here, if we look at, like, for example, the SSL risk, it shows some of the URLs that have potential issues. So if we expand out one of these, we can see that this has an older version of TLS activated on this. And so the vendor threat is something that is monitoring monitoring these things ongoing. And so as risks, as things are provided, whether it's brand level, whether it's notification of a breach, this type of thing with your vendors, you can actively monitor this as time goes on. Now, the VTM doesn't necessarily replace the need for a vendor assessment to be done on an annual basis, but it does give you the ongoing monitoring and to give you that type of information. So ultimately, the vendor risk managed service provides you with the ability to put a lot of the management, a lot of the day-to-day details, communication, and tracking down vendors with our services, and we provide that. And it can save you a lot of time, because once you've given us that and you've given us the ability to communicate with their vendor, then we can step in and manage that whole process for you. And another thing that happens is we have active project management that goes on with these, and you would get a weekly or whatever frequency you would like. You would get an update on what the status of the current assessments in progress. And so hopefully you can see that this process would provide you with a very nice way to manage all of your vendor assessments that need to happen. And within our team, we have a few consultants that all work on this particular item. So if you have a lot of different assessments that need to go on at the same time, we can have our whole team address those as we go along. So hopefully this has given you a good amount of information that describes the way the vendor risk works. Thank you.